I'm Carl King, and this is the Carl King Podcast, where we learn about music, filmmaking, and the other creative arts. To support this podcast, head over to patreon.com/carlking and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Chooch Dobe. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Tune Track, and Millennia Media. And now, let's get this episode beginned. Very good friends of Carl King, I have just a few Carl King the Human updates. Number 1, I joined another cult recently. Can't remember how many cults I'm in at the moment, but this cult is based around the podcast called Lifespan by Dr. David Sinclair, and I became aware of him through the Huberman Lab podcast. Dr. David Sinclair teaches us how to avoid disease and live longer so we can make more podcasts that no one hears. And as a member of the Lifespan cult, I am only allowed to eat once a day. Folks, I never thought this would be possible, but I am actually adapting to only eating once a day. On most days, I eat a big lunch, and that's it. But that's not actually it. Because I'm a podcaster, I also take Athletic Greens AG1 mixed with wheatgrass powder and some hemp protein, which only has a total of about 150 calories. And that's usually around 7 or 8 p.m. when the hunger is really hitting me. My wife says that that's technically breaking my intermittent fast, but I don't mind. By the way, this is not an ad for Athletic Greens, but I wish it were, and I would happily join their cult too. Anyway, I will put a link to Dr. David Sinclair and his Lifespan podcast in the show notes. Number 2, I have officially been diagnosed with sleep apnea, a disease that is slowly killing me, because that's what it does. If you haven't heard of this, it's where you stop breathing over and over and over as you sleep. And it does 2 things. Number 1, it interrupts the oxygen supply to your brain and heart and other organs. And 2, it keeps you from getting into a deep sleep, which your brain and body need. I actually had a close friend who died a few years ago from chronic sleep apnea, and I already have some long-term effects from it. So I'm working with doctors to get this under control. And 3, this is the 42nd episode of the Carl King Podcast overall, but the 25th episode I have produced in 2022. That is, since the relaunch. And that means, according to my very poor Carl King mathematics, if I keep this show going throughout 2023, we will be approaching 100 episodes at this same time next year. Or actually, at this rate, we'd probably hit 100 episodes at the beginning of 2024. But that's the same thing mathematically. So here are some questions or things to think about. Will I keep this show going that long? And what will happen if I do? Will I have enough listeners by then to take on sponsors? And how will the format change over time? We don't know yet. But I can say I am thankful to all of the good friends of Carl King for sticking around and listening. And now, let's get into the analytical music analysis of the week. This week, since it's the holiday season, we are going to do an analytical musical analysis of the Edward Scissorhands main titles by Danny Elfman from 1990. Now, have you ever wondered why Danny Elfman's music sounds spooky and dark and magical? Well, as your very good friend and a person who analyzes music, I will do my best to explain. First of all, it's because we form cultural associations with sounds. Kind of like Pavlov's dog, those sounds trigger visuals and feelings. So Danny Elfman uses specific chords and scales and rhythms and even instrumentation that remind us of spooky and dark and magical. And that reinforces the story. Without those shared cultural associations, the music of Edward Scissorhands would just be sounds. Now, music theory helps us categorize those sounds and their cultural associations into a system or a language. Just as writers learn to use words, composers of music use established chords and scales and rhythms and instrumentation. Now, music is not conjured out of some mystical realm. Those chords and scales and rhythms and instruments have been around for centuries. And film composers pretty much adhere to a collective vocabulary. They know how to write a heroic action movie, or a romance, or a comedy. And these genres have all been explored in classical music. Think of all the operas and ballets that have been written, and you will realize that film scores are nothing new. And so the music of Edward Scissorhands sounds like a lot of the spooky, dark, magical, classical music Danny Elfman grew up listening to, like Bernard Herrmann, Dmitri Shostakovich, and Igor Stravinsky. Disclaimer, I am not accusing Danny Elfman of being derivative any more than every composer in the world is derivative. It is all part of the creative tradition. And by the way, I'm only going to focus on the first track in the film score, which is actually called Introductions, Titles, and it is 2 minutes, 37 seconds long. One last thing. Edward Scissorhands is considered a Christmas film because the story takes place during Christmas time, and the instrumentation is reminiscent of Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker, which is another Christmas story based on an old Christmas fairy tale. You might be familiar with the dance of the sugar plum fairy from The Nutcracker, and it also used a specific twinkly percussive instrument that we hear prominently in this cue. So listen for that. And before we get into the main titles, I have to mention this. In the actual film, over the 20th Century Fox logo, for about 10 seconds, there's a short cue that doesn't appear at the beginning of this actual opening track. I'm guessing they pasted that in later, or they simply omitted it when they compiled the score album. Okay, here we go. This main titles piece is in the key of C minor, which is a good choice of key. So right off the bat, we have a dark minor sound, which is perfect for a sad fairy tale. And it is mostly in a 3/4 time signature. Now, for all the non-musicians, that means the music is counted like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Kind of like a waltz, which is appropriate to represent Winona Ryder dancing around in the snow. Although that scene is in 4/4, so I have no idea what I'm talking about. But that 3/4 time signature of this cue reminds us of a European dance. And if you're familiar with Mary Poppins, another piece in this same time signature and key of C minor is Chim, Chim, Cheree. And I'll post a link to that in the show notes. Another famous piece of music in 3/4 time, and also in that same C minor key, would be the Second Waltz by Shostakovich, one of Danny Elfman's favorite composers. And I will also put a link to that in the show notes. Now, if you listen to those two tracks, I think you will hear that the music of Edward Scissorhands fits into this genre of sad or dark minor key waltzes, but with a few special twists and turns. The tempo of this piece fluctuates somewhat freely, which is always nice to hear in music. It was probably conducted manually and without a click. as opposed to so much of the metronomic DAW music we hear these days. The piece floats around in the 110 to 116 BPM range, and there are brief moments of accelerando where the music speeds up, and ritardando where the music slows down. You remember when music used to do that? Anyway, I broke this cue into 3 main sections, which I will refer to as A, B, and C. And there are also variations of these sections, like the intro and the outro. And this piece does start with an intro for some reason. And the first thing we hear is a C minor chord. And it's in the upper register. So on a piano, it would be played way over to the right of the keyboard. Now, before we go any further, I need to point out that it's always important to choose your orchestration according to the note or chord's letter name. For instance, all A chords should be played on an instrument whose name starts with A, such as an accordion. And all B notes should be played on something like a bagpipe. Now, I did not make up those rules. I only follow them, and there is simply no chance that my orchestration teacher was lying to me. So that C minor chord is played, you guessed it, on an instrument that we can all agree begins with the letter C, and it's either pronounced Celeste or Celeste, depending on if you're on the East Coast or West Coast, but there's no need to get upset and have another incident. Now, think about that. If this had been a D minor chord, we might have associated Edward Scissorhands with a didgeridoo. And since you asked, here's some Hollywood trivia. Remember that film that never got made, Superman Lives, directed by Tim Burton and starring Nicolas Cage as Superman? Well, I know a lot of people in Hollywood, and I can tell you the secret of why that film was canceled. It's because Danny Elfman wrote the main theme in the key of E major, which meant that the score was only allowed to be performed with an egg shaker. Anyway, back to our analysis. The celesta is an instrument associated with either a spooky or magical or even creepy sound. And it's used in plenty of horror movies like The Shining from 1980 and Suspiria from 1977. So Danny Elfman's choice to feature it here fit within that kind of spooky genre. By the way, that C minor chord is played in various inversions. And for those who don't know what the heck an inversion is, it's a way of arranging the notes of a chord. So for instance, our C minor chord has 3 notes in it: C, E flat, and G. And you can invert it by putting the highest note, G, on the bottom. Or the middle note, E flat, on the bottom. Can you hear how those are slight variations of the same chord? Using inversions are a way to make the chords not sound so basic. You can sort of disguise them and get more mileage out of them. And here are some more extreme examples, and all of them are made up of the same 3 notes. Danny Elfman is actually big on using inversions in all of his scores. And for simplicity, for the rest of this analysis, I am going to intentionally overlook all other inversions of chords. We're going to pretend it's entirely root position block chords, because otherwise we'd be here all day and we'd get lost in even smaller details. Now, for the non-musicians out there, Danny Elfman uses only 2 chords in this intro: the C minor and the G major. And these are very common chords. I'm sure they sound very familiar to your ear. And for the musicians, it's 3 measures of that C minor chord, which is the minor tonic chord, and then we get 3 measures of a G major, the dominant, the 5 chord. It might even be a dominant 7th chord, and I will leave that to you to decide. And remember, these are the 2 most basic chords in the minor key. And that means that so far, nothing revolutionary has happened. 90% of the songs in the universe use these 2 basic 1 and 5 chords. You could even say that they are the fundamental chords that define a key. However, I do want to point out here that each of those chords or phrases lasts only 3 measures. Well, that's odd, isn't it? Normally, each phrase would be an even number of measures, usually 2 or 4 or 8. And that means that on measure 7, we get the first real indication we're dealing with Danny Elfman. And there is a sequence of 3 chords, C minor, F, and G. And in the key of C minor, that would be the minor 1, the major 4, and the major 5. And for the non-musicians in the audience, it would more commonly sound like this: C minor, F minor, and G major. But he makes that F minor chord an F major. So it's an uplifting and magical sound to use those 2 major chords in a row. Now, for the musicians out there, you probably know we are briefly in melodic minor, where both the 4 and the 5 chords are major instead of minor. Now, I haven't fully formed my argument about this, but I don't believe minor keys are real keys. I think they're just altered major keys. Maybe someday I'll be able to better explain that belief. Anyway, that F major chord really jumps out because it wasn't expected. And that F major is held out for a bar of 4 instead of 3. So Danny Elfman is changing time signatures for only 1 measure, adding an extra beat, which gives that striking chord even more emphasis. Still, this is nothing revolutionary in the world of classical music. While you could say it is very Elfman, it's still all by the book. Next, we move into what I'm calling the B section mini, or mini B section. And it is a teaser of what's going to come later. And because of that, it is shorter. It's only 7 bars. Now, isn't that odd? For the non-musicians out there, most musical phrases are broken up into 2, 4, 8, or 16-bar chunks, because 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. So these powers of 2 are most easy for listeners to digest without thinking about it. It's sort of like how we walk in steps of 2, left, right, left, right. So a phrase that is 7 bars is a nice way of surprising the listener, even if it's kind of a subconscious surprise. It's as if your brain has to take 2 steps with its left foot to get you back in sync. However, that full B section we get later is a not odd 16 bars. For the musicians out there, this sequence of chords has classic Danny Elfman instant modulations. You might call them non-diatonic chords, or even modal interchange. For the non-musicians out there, basically all you need to know is that a key has 7 basic chords in it. And that's 1 for each note of the scale. And it's expected that when you're in a key, you work with only those 7 chords, unless you eventually change keys. But if you do, it's expected you stay with the 7 chords in that new key for a while, because it keeps the listener's ear focused and helps us know where we are at. Well, Danny Elfman is breaking that rule. He's using chords that are, in a way, kind of wrong. He's jumping outside the key and using chords that aren't in that formula. And those chords trick our ears. Now, I used to argue with my music theory teachers that there's really no such thing as keys, and you can move to any chord you want to without justifying it. Still, since most popular music we hear is written in a key signature, it is a useful tool, or map, for understanding what the heck is happening. Anyway, there are 6 chords here in Danny Elfman's mini B section, and they go like this: C minor, G major, A flat major, back to G major, D flat major, and back to G major, which would be minor 1, major 5, major flat 6, back to 5, major flat 2, and then back to 5. So let's look closer at these. The C minor and the G major are in the key, but that A flat major breaks the rules in a small way. For the musicians out there, the notes in the A flat major chord are A flat, C, and E flat. So that A flat major is in the C natural minor key, but right next to it we have a G major, which is in C melodic minor. So you could argue that he's kind of changing keys here, or simply switching between which version of C minor he's adhering to. However, this is not an unusual move in classical music either. It's still all pretty much by the book. But then we do finally get that big Danny Elfman moment, and it is that D flat major chord. It sounds very out of place, almost otherworldly. And for the musicians, that flat supertonic major chord really jumps out because, first of all, the D flat note is not in the key of C natural minor. And remember, the notes of C natural minor are C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, and B flat. And that D flat major chord would use the notes D flat, F, and A flat, which means that D flat would be a flat 2. So it could be analyzed like this. Danny Elfman is grabbing that D flat major chord from the C Phrygian mode, which is closely related to C natural minor with only one note difference. Now, if you want to go deeper into the confusion, that A flat major could be thought of as the major 1 chord of A flat major. That C minor could be the minor 3 mediant chord, and the D flat could be the major 4 chord, which would make only the G major chord out of the key. But in either case, one of the chords won't belong in the key. So I say we go back to thinking of this piece in C minor. Now that D flat major chord is special because it is also a tritone away from the G major chord, which sounds especially magical and possibly evil, and very Danny Elfman. By the way, for variety, he also does use some inversions to repeat the chord across 2 measures. And it is in the 4/4 time signature again, as those violins climb up the scale to draw it out. Now we move on to A section number 1. And I call this the A section because it has a catchy melody with these notes. And that's G, F, E flat, F, G, C, and B. And over a C minor chord, those scale degrees would be 5, 4, 3, 4, 5, 8, and 7. Although that 7 or B note is played over a G major chord. And in this first A section, the melody is given to the choir. And that 4-bar melody repeats twice. Nothing unusual here. But at bar 26 of this whole piece, I think I hear what I'm going to call a mini Stravinsky. because unless I'm wrong, he seems to be using these two chords, F minor to G major. But it also doesn't come off as a hard cadence, so I'm assuming he's using some inversions there. The contrabass pizzicato sounds strange, so I will leave that to the music nerds as extra credit. Anyway, if I am correct, this is the chordal relationship you'll find in his theme from the film Batman, and also Stravinsky's Firebird Suite. But these could all be considered fair game in the key of C minor. There's really nothing unorthodox happening. It's still very tonal classical music. And then we move on to A section number 2. Now the melody is given to the oboe, and the choir sings counter melodies. And as far as I can tell, it was simply a variation to continue the same basic idea. Now at measure 50, we have the B section, in which we get more rapid chord movement and more non-diatonic chords. It sounds like this: C minor, G major, A flat major, G major, F minor, D flat major, G major, and A flat major. And those Roman numerals would be minor 1, 5 major, flat 6 major, 5 major, 4 minor, flat 2 major, 5, and then back to flat 6 major. At bar 66, we get a C section, and it is 8 bars long, changing chords each measure. So the sequence of chords goes like this: C minor, G major, A flat major, D flat major, G major, D flat major, G major, and back to D flat major. That's a minor 1, major 5, flat 6 major, flat 2 major, 5 major, flat 2 major, 5 major, and back to flat 2 major. And the most notable thing happening here is after the first 3 chords, the C minor, G major, and A flat major, we have a sequence of D flat majors and G majors, back and forth between the two. D flat major, G major, D flat major, G major, and D flat major. Now, why are those notable? Well, first of all, because they are 2 major chords a tritone apart, which we always like to hear. Second, because over that D flat major, the melody is playing the notes G and F, which would be the sharp 4 and major 3rd, creating a Lydian sound. We have yet another modal shift by Danny Elfman, and Lydian is a mode he uses often. For extra credit, go check out the theme from The Simpsons. Anyway, he repeats those notes G and F in the melody over the next chord, but they become the 1 and the flat 7 over G. Then, over the next D flat major, he climbs up 3, sharp 4, and 5, staying with that Lydian sound. And over the next 2 bars, it's another G major and D flat major, with a crescendo into the outro. Now for the outro, he returns to a version of the A section, but he now seems to have instantly modulated to the key of F minor. He's using the chords F minor and C major. So he's taken the same idea from the previous A section and moved it to a new key. But this is what freaks me out. He cleverly flips it around somehow and resolves to the C major chord at the end, which would be the 5 chord in F minor. So he makes that F minor sound like a minor 4 chord in the key of C major. And the C major now sounds like the tonic chord. And this is one of the most baffling things in the piece. I truly do not understand how that's happening. I've listened to it over and over, and it should not happen, but in my mind it does. Okay then, I will let everyone know. By the way, if we consider this whole piece to be in the key of C minor, that final chord would be called a Picardy third, which is when you end a minor key piece on a major chord. It's a brighter and happier sound. At the end of the film, and coincidentally at the end of the musical score, there's a track that is for some reason called The End, and it coincidentally plays under the end credits. Anyway, it's an expanded version of the main titles cue. There's lots of fun theme and variation stuff happening. So, to sum it up, why does Danny Elfman's Edward Scissorhands sound spooky and dark and magical? Well, number one, his choice of instrumentation. Celesta is considered a spooky instrument, and its bell-like quality is also reminiscent of Christmas. So why not a spooky Christmas? And hey, choirs can be pretty spooky too. Number two, his use of a minor key, which we associate with darkness or sadness. Number three, that 3/4 time signature, which reminds us of a European dance. And number four, chords that are outside of the key for surprise. Specifically a chord that is a tritone leap away, which can sound otherworldly, or evil, or magical, depending on the context. So if someone were to ask me to compose a piece of music that sounds like Edward Scissorhands, these are the sorts of elements I would be looking at closely. And I recommend you give this entire score a listen, and I will put a link to it in the show notes. And now let's move on to the analytical film analysis of the week. This week, for the analytical film analysis of the week, we have a decent pairing. We're going to examine an unrelated film also called Edward Scissorhands from 1990. It was directed by Tim Burton, whose birthday is the day before mine, and that explains how he had such a head start in his career. The film was screenwrited by Carolyn Thompson, and she also applied her screenwriting talents to the films Corpse Bride, Addams Family, and Nightmare Before Christmas. And two of those also being directed by Tim Burton. Now, I'm going to focus on this film from a screenwriting perspective. What do I mean by that? Well, a screenplay, also called a script, is more than just the dialogue. The actors don't just show up with their lines memorized and make everything else up. It's the screenwriter's job to invent the movie. The theme, the plot, the characters, the setups and payoffs, the surprises, the conflicts, the locations, the world. It's broken down into acts, and it's expected to follow a standard formula and pacing, and everything important to the story should be there. So when I say screenwriting, I'm referring to all of that. And even though I'm not working from the original screenplay, I'm going to look at it mostly from the perspective of a screenwriter. So here we go. First up, I wonder if those opening titles were edited to the music, because there are fast flashes of cookie cutter shapes in sync with those pizzicato strings. It would have been tricky back then to sync up the tempo and pizzicato strings with those exact frames. It would have been so much easier the other way around. Now, what we have here at the beginning is called a frame story. Remember the Princess Bride? Well, that was another frame story. And it's a story told by the person inside the story. And in this case, it's an old woman putting her granddaughter to bed. And the old woman, spoiler alert, is Winona Ryder. So I wonder, who did she end up marrying from the little town and having a child with who had another child? Did she eventually get back together with that macho loser played by Anthony Michael Hall. Either way, we get a good once upon a time setup question from the little girl because she asks, "Where does snow come from?" And the grandmother has a very long story to explain it. And this is all a straight-up fairy tale, much like The Nutcracker, a ballet by Tchaikovsky. Well, here's some trivia. The Nutcracker was based on another story from 1816 called The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. And it is just perfect for having a psychedelic Christmas. Now, back to our film. Edward lives alone in a spooky castle on the edge of what we'll call Normal Town. And down in Normal Town, everything is pastel colors. And that sets up the contrast of the extremes. We've got this weirdo goth kid, and we put him where he doesn't belong, around a bunch of bright colors and housewives. Now, these extreme contrasts can also be found in David Lynch films. The pairing of a normal, everyday small town and something very dark. Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet definitely come to mind. And by the way, some of the shots in Edward Scissorhands are very David Lynch. For instance, when the lady with the huge 80s hair sits down on her couch and dials the phone in that 70s living room. Now, regarding Normal Town, my first thought was, this looks a lot like the neighborhoods in Florida. The houses and the lawns. And sure enough, that's exactly where it was filmed, about an hour from where I grew up. But according to the internet, Tim Burton meant for it to look like Burbank, where he grew up. And it kind of does. The main difference is that Burbank has those iconic trees all along the sides of the street. But Normal Town in Edward Scissorhands does not have those Burbank trees, which are iconic from so many movies. Anyway, it was convenient that Edward was taken in by an Avon lady because of his pale complexion and scars. It was the perfect setup for gags between the two of them. But being an Avon lady is also a good small-town American relatable thing. Or was in a different era. The Avon lady has an obliviousness, which actually mirrors Edward's. Both of them don't seem to truly understand the people around them. And she's somehow eccentric enough herself to not be fazed much by the creepy castle or the scissors. And the neighbors in Normal Town are possibly just as horrified by the Avon lady as they would be by Edward. Like, oh no, here she comes again. And some of the kids even tease her. But oddly enough, they seem to like Edward more than they like her. Now, at about 37 minutes into this film, I realized there is very little plot, or even much drama. Once Edward is brought to her house, the story kind of flatlined. Just think about it. Aside from the religious lady, who only makes brief appearances, no one has goals or wants. It's a stable situation. There's no plan, there's no forward motion, but that's fine, I'll keep watching. So something I noticed when the van full of kids stopped to let Winona Ryder out, isn't that a bizarre place to stop? It's right in the middle of the street, nowhere near the curb. Well, okay then, I will let everyone know. Now, if I recall, more than one car in this film parks like that. Was that an intentional Tim Burton demand, or some sort of behind-the-scenes technical problem they had? We don't know yet. Regarding Winona Ryder's character, it was a good move to have her wear a blonde wig. First of all, because she represents a typical cheerleader, and second, to create contrast against Edward. In the final scenes, she even wears a white dress, so the pair could be so-called opposites, light and dark. So I'm still watching, and at 48 minutes in, that's nearly an hour, there is still barely any conflict. Aside from Anthony Michael Hall not liking Edward, no one is trying to achieve anything. It's just a series of cute scenes. Yes, he has scissors for hands. He pops the waterbed. He uses his scissors at the barbecue to shish kebab. He gives haircuts. We explore all the ways his scissor hands play out in everyday circumstances. But an entire hour goes by before there is any real conflict or goals. Edward and the horny housewife lady do decide to open a salon, which isn't all that exciting. But finally, there is a burglary plot that Winona Ryder's boyfriend comes up with. And it creates drama, puts people at odds, and gives everyone something to disagree about. Folks, I have to say it. Edward Scissorhands has an incredibly slow plot. That is, according to the standards of modern screenwriting. Can you name another movie where it takes an hour for the first major thing to go wrong? But hey, I consider myself a plot denier. I can watch a movie with zero plot as long as it's heavy on character. But I only noticed the lack of plot here because there wasn't a lot of character either. At least not in the first hour. Act 2 was pretty lighthearted and conflict-free. It's just a bunch of fun and games. And I would even say it was flat in my own totally subjective opinion. Now, I'm not here to say whether the end result is good or bad because a lot of people do love this film. But that previous 40 minutes of Edward acting confused and doing landscaping could have been seriously condensed. And these days it probably would have been, at least by any screenwriting teacher or alpha nerd bully executive. Now here's something I enjoyed. The symbolism of Edward's clothing. He starts out dressed as himself in that S&M suit, and when he comes to Normal Town, they put normal clothes over the suit. And slowly, as he devolves psychologically, those normal clothes get progressively shredded and torn, until later in the film, he finally just loses it and cuts them off, returning to his original state as a social outcast. Now, what is this film really about? I think it's about an artist who is rejected by society, but not because his art is bad. They actually love his art. It's because he accidentally hurts people. So he ends up alone in a castle carving ice sculptures. But I'm wondering, how did he get those big blocks of ice up there? Well, we don't know yet. And this could be another violation of Wells's law. But then again, Edward Scissorhands is a fairy tale with a sad ending. And that's all we need to know for now. Since it's a classic, and my mom says I used to look like Johnny Depp, I gave Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands 5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. Okay, that's the end of this episode of the Carl King Podcast. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere else you listen to these dang podcasts. And support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. And as always, special thank you to my $51 a month patrons at the Special Illusionist level, Chubode, and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for listening. And as I always say, okay then, I will let everyone know.